Hello, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I am going to be doing my August reviews. These are for the books that were outside of the Sealey challenge because I will have a separate video talking about the books I read for the Sealey challenge and my thoughts on them and poetry in general. So these were the other books that I read in August. I read 10 books in August and most of those were actually read physically. 7 of those were physical reads and 3 were audiobooks. I am pretty proud of that because in August I was back home, I was trying to read more from my shelves, so it was really great to see that reflected in the number of books that I was pulling, and that is also something that was a trend in the Sealey challenge, so I am happy that more physical books are making their way into my stats. In terms of author backgrounds, 6 of the books I read were by white authors. 1 was an anthology of Indigenous authors, so they are from various different communities across North America. 1 was an author with a Swana background, 1 was South Asian, and 1 was Latinx. The countries that I read from were the United States, Palestine, and Sri Lanka. My average star rating was a 4.1. And there were 4 books with queer themes in them this month. I am going to talk about these books in the order that I read them. So I started off August with Men in the Sun and Other Palestinian Stories by Ghassan Kanafani. This was translated from the Arabic by Hilary Kilpatrick. And this is one that I gave 4 out of 5 stars to. And these stories are really centered on the Palestinian experience in the years after the Nakba and Palestinians living in diaspora. What I love about Kanafani's work is that he doesn't beat you over the head with these moral allegories or metaphors. He knows who the victims and the perpetrators are, and he doesn't need to explicitly state that in the text. It is implied, although never directly spoken about, because the focus is not on diasporic violence, colonial violence, it's on the actual lived experiences of Palestinians. And there's so much unsaid in his books. There are these moments of dialogue where you really feel the weight of loss and displacement and alienation from these communities of people who, although I don't feel like this collection is trying to universalize the Palestinian experience, there's obviously shared experiences among the stories, but there's still a unique voice to be found within each of the stories in this collection. And I found that the stories are not so explicitly centered on pain and suffering, but more on resilience and resistance. The standout one for me was The Land of Sad Oranges. In this story, Kanafani ties food, family, and land all together. And this is an area that I am frequently interested in the intersection of how does food shape identity? How does food establish this connection to the land that it's grown on, the land that its people were raised in and born from as well? And this is a story that just really lingered with me for a long time after finishing it. Similar to that feeling was the last story in this collection, which instead of about leaving Palestine is about returning to Palestine. Specifically, the last story is the story of a man who is returning to Gaza, and he is writing a letter explaining why he is making this decision, because he has the opportunity to leave, and yet he feels like this is a moral injustice to leave at a time where his homeland needs him the most. Of course, the ongoing colonial violence that is happening in Gaza right now is a stark reminder of the history and the legacy behind the current events that we're witnessing. And I think that's what made that story a little bit more heartbreaking, but also more inspiring, because you see that there is still this connection. There is still this belief in change and hope for the future. And although that is not currently the state of Gaza, it's a reminder of this continued hope for resistance, resilience, and liberation that I think was really amazing. Those were the stories that I found the most impactful in that collection, although the titular story is one that is also pretty haunting. I think this was actually a really good translation, because something I have had issues with before is when Arabic has been translated into English, the translations are kind of awkwardly phrased, or there is a lot more metaphorical or prose-like language that doesn't translate well to English, where we're more direct in writing. But I didn't feel that way here. I actually really enjoyed the writing, and so I think that that is not only a sign of Kanafani's amazing writing, but also Kilpatrick's really good translation in this. The next book that I read was kind of a perfect follow-up to Men in the Sun, and also a perfect predecessor to a book that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and that is Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag. This is a new favorite for me. I was really blown away by how much I actually was impacted by this. This is a collection of essays that are exploring the ethics of war photography and war journalism, and it's also kind of interrogating not just the field of photojournalism, but also the viewership of photojournalism. And so it's asking the reader what it means to witness violence through an image, who is allowed to look at this, who gets their image taken, and what cost does that have for both the person in the photo, the person taking the photo, and the people seeing this. It has a lot of questions about media consumption, spectatorship, and the commodification of violence. And I think that these are all things that are kind of heartbreaking to know that even back in the early 2000s when this was written, that this was a question being asked that we still haven't found a answer or solution to today, because this book was actually published right after 9/11. I think it was published in 2002 or 2003, because parts of the book actually talk about the photojournalism of 9/11 and how the ethics of that were handled, where there were a lot of ethical dilemmas about should we photograph this violence. And Susan Sontag really pushes back at that and says, why is it not okay to photograph this violence, but it's okay to photograph a child in Vietnam, or a child killed in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or a man that is involved in a massacre? Why do some people get to have the worst day of their life forever ingrained in an image, and other people don't get that as well? And if it's unethical for one person, why is it not unethical for the other? Some of the most profound reflections in this were actually on her discussions about the evolution of war. It's no longer soldier-to-soldier combat. Now warfare has evolved to really directly targeting civilians, and this has changed photojournalism because of that. So she talks about the history of this and the history of photojournalism really starting in really the Civil War era, but then how that has evolved over time. And I think that it's a really astute observation to see how this difference in combative styles has also shaped photographic trends, and why that is a problem, because there's a geopolitical bias and there's often racialized components to that. Again, there is this question of whose suffering do we care about and whose do we scroll past. There were also some surprising future implications that are discussed in this book that I was almost like screaming about, because I couldn't believe that Susan Sontag had predicted some of the things that she talks about could be possible in the future, and I desperately wanted to know what her opinions would be if she had lived longer, because she talks a lot about misinformation and how photojournalism can be manipulated depending on the person publishing it, and that there may eventually be technology that can even manipulate these things. Although Sontag was not aware of this, there would eventually be deep fakes and AI. It's really interesting to me that she is kind of talking about these things, obviously not knowing what would happen, and yet today we can see that what she considered to be a growing crisis at the time of media illiteracy is becoming an even more overwhelming problem nowadays. I thought that was astounding, because I really couldn't imagine someone predicting something like that so vividly, because it really was, I mean, even the descriptions were really close to what we now know of as deep fakes or AI generated images, and how those can be used as tools of propaganda. This was just a book that I wish would be required reading, if not solely for photojournalism and journalism ethics courses, but also in general for the public, because Susan Sontag is not giving you the answers to these questions. She is instead interrogating the reader to be more aware of how we consume the suffering of others. But I think also as a society, this is more important now than ever, because there is new technology that changes the way that media operates. There's obviously more polarization today, and there are these very intricately designed propaganda machines to feed media, information, photos, things like this. So it becomes really important to interrogate yourself and your beliefs and your understanding of things, and then interrogate the media that you consume in the same way. And that was my biggest takeaway from this book. I really loved it. Once I finished this one, I ended up immediately giving it to one of my closest friends, because she studied journalism in university and she was required to take an ethics course. And she and I have had many conversations about these journalistic ethical dilemmas that have happened in the last so many years that we've known each other. And this was now kind of like a supplementary material to discussing this and re-examining some things we've discussed. So yes, I really, really enjoyed this one. And I think it was maybe my most important read of the month in terms of what it taught me in the end. The next book that I read was The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School by Sonora Reyes. This is one that I gave 3 out of 5 stars. And this follows the story of 16-year-old Yamilet Flores, who is hiding her sexuality, and she and her brother are newly enrolled in a Catholic school because her brother was having a lot of issues at their previous school. She has kind of been determined to be her brother's minder, and there's a lot of pressure on her and her family to make sure her brother does well and to support her brother, but no one is really supporting Yamilet. Through the course of this book, she's navigating this very complicated family dynamic that she has, this hiding of her sexuality because of her family's perceived religious views and how that may affect their views of her. And additionally, she is having some feelings for a classmate who has turned into a friend, while also building new friend groups and trying to decide what to do in all of this. And this is a young adult book, so obviously Yamilet is not making the most reasonable of choices at times. She's not having the most logical of thoughts, and so that is definitely a part of this story. But I think there's this really beautiful journey that the author takes Yamilet on through this book, and I loved following along with her and seeing her start to reflect on her life and her decisions and the way that she viewed things. I think that was a really important part of this story. I can't lie that this book is pretty heavy at times. You know, there's talk of depression, intergenerational trauma, and the fear of coming out and rejection and what that may mean. There are really hard-hitting parts of this book that are really emotional for the reader, and I think that it's balanced well in terms of it didn't feel so all-consuming or overwhelming. Like, this book didn't feel primarily negative, but there's definitely heavier parts to it that I think some readers might want to be aware of. In terms of those aspects of the book, I thought that that was done really well. However, there was a really big problem with the pacing and the setup of the story in this book. The first half was really scattered for me, and it really felt like it was relying on these very stereotypical tropes for the YA genre. Like, it couldn't decide what exactly it wanted to be, and so it made it difficult for me to really stay engaged in that part of the story because I felt like I was constantly rolling my eyes. The second half was much stronger, it was much more focused, and there was more emotional weight given to some scenes in the second half that needed it. I wish that some of that emotional impact would have come earlier in the story, because by the time it gets there, if you're not invested in the characters, it's really hard to feel that emotional punch. I think the second half was much stronger, and I really enjoyed this story once I got to the meat of it. However, when I was about to finish this book, I thought, okay, this will probably be like a 4-star read, and then the ending happened. I will not explain the ending, but I will say that it's incredibly drawn out. It's very dramatized, and it really took away from my experience with this book. It just felt unnecessary. Yeah, it just really wasn't for me in the end. I do have another book on my shelves by this author. I think I would be open to reading them again, because I don't know if, you know, there might be changes, because they've written a few more books after this one. I also know that there is a sequel to this one that's following the brother that we meet here, which I may actually end up picking that up one day, but it might be a while. We will have to see. So that was a pretty big series of heavier reads, and I was looking for something that would be more fun to read. And I landed on Ancestor Approved, which is an anthology of intertribal stories for children. This is edited by Cynthia Leitich Smith, and this was lovely. The best word that I can think of to describe this book is joyful, because that is how I felt as I was reading these stories. So this book is a series of interconnected stories written by different Indigenous authors, and it follows people who are all coming to this Mother Earth powwow that is in Michigan. There's people from all different cultures, different parts of North America, and speaking different languages. I did like that at the back of this book there is like a glossary for words from different languages, and it explains what language it's from and gives like the closest English equivalency. I found that to be really helpful while reading. The stories definitely do share common themes. However, I didn't think that they were repetitive. I really liked this idea of all of these stories happening in the same place. And there is a character that makes an appearance in literally almost every story, I think. And that was really fun. I loved that little cameo as it kept happening. There was a good balance of warm, joyful moments and also heavier topics that were discussed in a way that I think was really approachable and accessible for younger readers, but also still interesting and had depth there that would interest older readers. While I was reading this, I definitely understood that it was a children's book. However, it was still interesting enough for me as an adult that I was like curious about these different stories and characters. I felt that I was learning different things in certain stories. So it's one that I really do think is something that could be enjoyed by all ages. It felt like you were stepping into this community and just getting to see and understand so many different aspects of it. I just really loved this one. It is a book that I ended up keeping after I read it. That was a part of my summer project, was to go through books that I owned and decide if I wanted to keep them or not after reading them. This is one that I wanted to keep because I think it's going to be a nice comfort read to be able to go back to, because I really felt like this collection improved my mood after reading it, and I definitely needed it after some really, really heavy reads. Similar to that, I read The Avant-Gardes Volume 1. This is written by Carly Usdin. This is a graphic novel, and I really liked Carly Usdin's heavy vinyl series. I know it's only a couple of volumes. I think the Avant-Garde series is also just a couple of volumes, but I really like her stories, and this one was no exception. This is the story of Charlie, who was attending a, let's say like a more sports-oriented university where they were playing on the basketball team, and they decided to switch schools and are now going to an arts college where there is a basketball team that is recruiting, and they convince Charlie to join. Charlie is finding a new community there and trying to figure out how to be herself. I really, really enjoyed this. I thought it was a very fun group that we were meeting. I thought the story was entertaining, although I will say that the story is pretty limited in this first volume. I kind of expected a little bit more to happen, and that was not the case. But I do plan to continue on with the series, so that's something I can look forward to. And the art style was really amazing in this as well. I loved how bright and vibrant it was. That is always something that I look for when I am reading graphic novels, because the art style is pretty important to picturing the story. That was one I ended up giving a 4 out of 5 stars to. The next book is The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida. This one has such a unique writing style, not only because it's told in second person, which is fairly uncommon in literature, but the way that it's written is just so gripping. From the very beginning, you are kind of in on this joke, but also in the head of this character. The way that you move through the story is understanding so many different people and who they are, their mindset, and then there's also the voice of the main character, Maali, who you're in the head of, and it was just, yeah, it was really, really fascinating to me. The story puts us in the middle of the Sri Lankan Civil War, where Maali, who was a war photographer, has been killed, and he has 7 moons to decide what he wants to do with his afterlife. If people say his name, he can go to those people, but otherwise there are some limitations to what he can do in the afterlife. And he doesn't remember why he died or who killed him, so he is trying to piece back together what happened, but also there is something that happened before he died, and he is trying to make sure that people are informed of this. So we're following him not only through his journeys to find these people and try to communicate with them, but also we are reflecting back on these memories throughout his life of these different periods of time, the people that he's met and how they became close to him, how he became involved with some of them. Maali was just such a compelling character. He's a very flawed individual, and he is in this kind of morally gray area, because it's not necessarily that he was really super passionate about photography, but it was kind of a means to an end. But also that kind of evolves for Maali throughout the course of this story. As you get to know him more through the story, he's very stubborn, he's funny, and he just felt so incredibly realistic. There are a lot of characters in this, but I think that each of them added to the story in their own way. I really liked the way that history has been incorporated into this novel, because there are many characters who we meet in the afterlife who are actually based on people who were public figures that were killed in the Sri Lankan Civil War. And some of them are directly named as they were in real life. Some of them, the names have been changed. I thought that was really fascinating because it leads the reader to doing more research about this conflict. I did not have a lot of background knowledge on the Sri Lankan Civil War. I think that in the book they intersperse this history and context in a way that feels not like an info dump and felt very natural with the storytelling method. However, it led to me wanting to do much more research, which I think is beneficial in understanding even more of the story here. Because this story was not just about Maali's life, it was also about the country around him and how that shaped his life, and also how this country was shaped in general as a kind of undercurrent to this story. Because I don't feel like this story focuses primarily on the history in this, but it's definitely a strong theme throughout that I think will be very interesting to readers. that I can understand would be very interesting for readers. Additionally, this book kind of served as a complement to Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag. I'm really glad that I read that book first and then this one, because I think it made this book a little bit more emotional for me in some ways, because you see Maali debating his career as a war photographer and all of these people telling him what they think it means to live this way. And you see this crisis that's unfolding in him throughout this story, the questions about the ethics of documenting this stuff, and then also this kind of debate throughout the story. Is it about thrill seeking? Is it about money? Is it just about the moral weight of bearing witness? And I don't think that Maali necessarily answers that, although I think that there are ways you can interpret some actions in the book. But I think that that served as really good background information to interrogate some parts of this book. And I think that helped me enjoy it a little bit more. I ended up giving this one a 4.5 out of 5 stars though, although I do consider this a favorite. There were some real problems with the pacing at the end of the book, and I'm not quite sure why this happened. I think it was partially that there was too much that had been left to the end, and then also simultaneously not enough to really drag it out more. But yeah, that was a pretty big problem. But regardless, I still really enjoyed this overall. After finishing that one, I then picked up Record of a Spaceborn Few by Becky Chambers. This is the third book in the Wayfarer series, and I have really been enjoying my time with the series. This book was no exception. This one starts out a little bit darker than some of the other books in the series, but I don't think it's as dark as the second book. I think that there was much more like hope and optimism in this one. But there is an event that happens in the beginning of this book, and you are following the fallout of this event and its lasting impact on this community, because this one is exploring the Exodian fleet, and I really enjoyed learning more about this specific community in this universe that Becky Chambers has created. I think that the central focus of this book is really more on traditions, rituals, and there's definitely a lot of mention of death, and I thought that was going to be really hard for me to read in this, but it actually wasn't. It was written in a way that was more comforting than anxiety-inducing, and I think that's really the perfect way to describe Becky Chambers' sci-fi writing in general, because I find sci-fi to be somewhat scary at times, and I think that Becky Chambers approaches it in a way that makes it something that is just really lovely. I am constantly in awe of how they have crafted this series, because there are just so many different questions about humanity and life and language. I mean, even culture and death and all of these things that we ask questions about now and we have these concerns about. But the way that it's crafted in this futuristic world is really relatable, and I really love that aspect to this because it's very humanizing and it gives this sort of interconnectedness with the stories that I really enjoy. I am a little sad because I technically only have one more book left in this series. I really hope that Becky Chambers returns to this at some point, because they could literally write 5 million books in this series, and I think I would try to read all of them because I really love how this world has expanded and grown and how each book has really tackled a different part of the universe. I think it's really lovely. And so yes, I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. I think I liked it a little bit more than the second book, but still the first book remains my favorite. Apparently, when I finished Record of a Spaceborn Few, I was really wanting to go in the opposite direction of cozy and comfy, because I finally picked up A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This was my introduction to Holly Jackson's writing, and I will say that this book, although it has received a lot of praise, is very strongly a young adult book. The writing is very young adult, it's very juvenile, and I think if you're going into this book and you're a reader of an older age, this might be something irritating, so it's something to be aware of, because this book definitely felt like being in the head of a 16-year-old or 15-year-old. I can't remember how old Pip is at the beginning of the book. I really liked that though. I thought that this was a book that felt very realistic of this age and this kind of belief that you are invincible and that you can solve all the world's problems. I loved Pip as a main character. I thought that she was not only really entertaining to follow along with, but also I really liked her own self-reflection in this and the way that she interrogates herself and her choices and her actions. If you don't know, this book follows a teenage girl who is writing a senior project about a murder that happened 5 years earlier in her town, where there is a young man who is suspected of murdering his girlfriend, although her body is never found, and he commits suicide shortly after she goes missing. And this has kind of ruptured this town. I mean, there are so many different people that were affected by this, and she starts investigating it, and it leads to her getting some revelations about what happened. And I do think that this approached a really difficult subject matter, not just this murder mystery aspect, but also other questions related to the ethics of journalism and safety in these small towns, and this kind of groupthink that is explored through this book as well, in terms of everyone believing someone is guilty, but what actually tells us that they are guilty. I really liked those aspects, and I thought they were explored with a lot of nuance in here. And I also found this book to actually be thrilling. There were parts of this where I could not put it down. I wanted to know what was happening next. I was even worried about what would happen next in some instances. I do want to add that I don't necessarily think that this story was fully fleshed out, and I believe this was most obvious when it comes to the characters and how they are constructed in this story. I am gonna kind of save my judgment on that until I finish the series, because by then it will be multiple books and we should have more developed characters by then. But I do plan to continue on with this series. I gave it a 4 to 5 stars, and I really enjoyed my time with it. I definitely want to watch the TV show after reading this one. Additionally, I continued on with another series this month, and that is the second Enola Holmes book, and this is The Case of the Left-Handed Lady by Nancy Springer. This is continuing on with the Enola Holmes story. This one is definitely different to the movie. I felt the same way in the first book. But this one I think is markedly different from the second movie's storyline. So it felt very new and refreshing, and I had a lot of fun with this one. I really like the writing style in this. I love following along with Enola. She is just such a fun main character. I will say that this mystery felt really simplistic. I have to remind myself that this is a middle grade mystery, so obviously it's not going to be super complex. However, this one didn't really seem that engaging for me personally. I did really like the side plot of Enola's family trying to find her and her outwitting them constantly. Yeah, I think that the ending was a little bit weird, the way things were wrapped up in terms of the mystery and the revelations that we get. That was not very big to me personally. I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I do want to continue on with this series. I am just not really sure that all of them are going to be of interest to me, because these really do feel like independent books. There is the guiding theme of Enola running away in the first book, and then her family is trying to find her. But each of these books have felt like their own individual stories. So that is kind of a good thing and a bad thing, because it means I could maybe possibly skip around, but it also may mean that some of the stories are just not as interesting to me. I am hoping that the third one will kind of up the ante a little bit for me, because this one I didn't enjoy as much as the first book. The last book that I finished the month off with was another mystery. This one was very interesting because it was a time travel mystery, which is a genre I don't think I've read from before. And this is A Rip Through Time by Kelley Armstrong. In this, we follow a detective who is visiting her dying grandmother in Scotland. She goes on a run and is attacked by someone, and then ends up waking up 150 years in the past because someone else had been attacked in the same area that she was 150 years in the past. And so she wakes up in this other woman's life and is confused about what is going on, and is trying to solve the attack against this woman, but also figure out how to get back to her own timeline. I really loved the main character in this one. I thought that she was very quick-witted and intelligent, and I liked this kind of internal dilemma that she is battling through this, of being a woman from a much more advanced in like quotations, generation, and trying to decide, when was this technological device invented? Should I be telling them this? Am I like causing this ripple effect? I also enjoyed her, trying to investigate this mystery. It felt like she was kind of carving her own path, and I really enjoyed that. I think that she was a very strong main character and really fun to follow along with. I love the subplot in this of her becoming the assistant to the surgeon that she works for, and this kind of dynamic with them where this is like a passion of hers that she didn't get to pursue because she had always been a detective. It was just a story that had all of the right elements for me. I wasn't expecting to enjoy it so much because historical fiction is a genre that I've gone back and forth with over the years, and it's been just very hit or miss. And this one was definitely a hit for me. I am really eager to see where this series goes because the ending was really well done in my opinion, but also the second book sounds really fascinating to me in terms of the mystery that they're going to be looking at in there. I do feel like I started a lot of series this month unintentionally, but I was just kind of in a mood for murder mysteries again, so I think that's why I started some of those. That concludes all of the books outside of the Sealey challenge that I read for the month of August. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know down below your thoughts on these books or thoughts about books that you read in August. I'm always looking for more book suggestions. And I want to thank you so much for watching this video, and happy reading. Bye!